Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating and honestly, absolutely crucial puzzle. Imagine a country where agriculture is literally the backbone of the economy. But every single planting season, farmers run into a brick wall. They face a critical shortage of the one thing they need most to ensure a good harvest: chemical fertilizer. So let's dive into the anatomy of Nepal's fertilizer supply chain breakdown and see exactly where this whole system is fracturing. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at 1. The supply-demand gap, 2. The bureaucratic procurement maze, 3. The ballooning subsidy burden, 4. Unequal regional distribution, and finally, 5. Fixing the broken chain. Okay, let's kick things off with part 1, the supply-demand gap. Before a farmer can even think about getting their fields ready, they hit the very first roadblock. There's just a sheer lack of physical supply actually entering the country. 800,000 metric tons. Now, that's not just some random guess. Based on specific crop nutrient requirements and provincial data, that's the annual effective demand for subsidized chemical fertilizers in Nepal. It is exactly what the country's soil needs to keep the agricultural economy humming and food on the table. But here's where it gets wild. When you contrast that towering 800,000 metric ton demand against the absolute peak historical supply, the shortfall is, well, it's glaring. The highest supply ever achieved over a 12-year period was just 441,315 metric tons, meaning even in their absolute best year on record, the supply barely scraped past the halfway mark of what farmers actually need. And historically, the supply isn't just insufficient, it's incredibly volatile. Take a look at that sharp drop we saw in 2021 and 2022, mostly due to global disruptions. But what's even more concerning is the chemical makeup of what actually does arrive. On average, a massive 62% of the supply is urea. But experts, they recommend urea should only make up about 49% of the fertilizer basket, balanced out with other critical nutrients like DAP and potash. So it's not just that farmers are getting too little fertilizer, they're getting an imbalanced mix that doesn't properly nourish their soil. It's kind of like trying to survive on just carbohydrates. Moving on to part 2, the bureaucratic procurement maze. So you might be wondering, why is there such a massive physical supply gap in the first place? Well, Nepal relies entirely on imports, and every single batch has to navigate this grueling 11-step centralized public procurement process. Managed by state entities, this whole ordeal involves putting together global tenders, 46-day waiting periods, technical evaluations, letters of credit, you name it. Literally every bureaucratic step creates a severe bottleneck before a ship even leaves a foreign port. The absolute biggest constraint here is time. Before a recent legal amendment, the law actually dictated that this procurement process was allowed to drag on for 210 days. That is 7 months of pure paperwork. Now, a 2026 amendment shortened this legal standard slightly to 187 days. But there's a huge catch here. These are just best-case scenarios on paper. They assume the global market is behaving perfectly. And as we all know, in the real world, things rarely go perfectly. 485 days. That is how long it actually took, on average, to import urea during that globally disrupted 2021-22 fiscal year. I mean, just imagine being a farmer waiting for fertilizer to plant your seasonal crops, and your shipment takes over a year and a third to arrive. By the time it clears customs, your critical planting window is completely gone. Next up, part 3, the ballooning subsidy burden. All of these delays and global dependencies, they create a staggering financial reality for the government, which essentially acts as a shock absorber. 26.8 billion Nepalese rupees. Over the study period, government expenditure on fertilizer subsidies exploded, rising nearly fivefold. To put the sheer scale of that number into perspective, these subsidies now consume over half of Nepal's entire agricultural budget. In one recent year, it actually spiked to an incredible 69%. The root cause of this massive cost is something called price shielding. See, the international procurement price of fertilizer fluctuates wildly based on global events and exchange rates. However, the fixed selling price for local farmers in Nepal is kept completely flat. When international prices skyrocket, the government just absorbs that massive financial blow to keep the local price cheap. In some extreme cases, the government is subsidizing over 65% of the total cost just to bridge that gap. Let's look at part 4, unequal regional distribution. Once this incredibly expensive, long-delayed fertilizer finally makes its way into Nepal, we have to ask, who actually gets it? Well, the distribution is highly unequal. As you can see, Madhya province consistently dominates the national allocation year after year, taking the absolute lion's share of total sales. followed by Koshi and Lumbini provinces. Now, while this does somewhat align with the region's high agricultural potential, it leaves very, very little of the limited supply for the rest of the nation. And this creates a picture of stark geographic inequality right at the farm level. In Madhya province, farmers are applying a robust 218 kilograms of fertilizer per hectare. But up in the remote and mountainous Karnali province, farmers receive a mere 34 kilograms per hectare. This massive discrepancy is largely driven by geographic constraints and inadequate transportation networks struggling across some really challenging terrain. Finally, Part 5. Fixing the Broken Chain. Having dissected this whole breakdown, what's to fix? Researchers recommend several targeted solutions. First, shifting to multi-year procurement contracts to finally bypass that agonizing 11-step annual tender process. Second, implementing scientific crop-based demand forecasting rather than just relying on rough estimates. Third, heavily increasing domestic storage to build a buffer stock against global supply chain hiccups. Fourth, regularly adjusting that subsidized sales price so it doesn't just bankrupt the agricultural budget. And finally, breaking the public monopoly by encouraging private sector participation. This could even involve a targeted voucher system to make absolutely sure the aid actually reaches the smallholder farmers who need it most. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative question. Can a nation truly secure its agricultural future while relying entirely on volatile global markets and footing a massive, constantly growing subsidy bill? The research makes it crystal clear that without systemic reform, this cycle of shortages and ballooning costs is just going to keep straining the nation. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it gave you a really clear view into the complex realities hiding behind a simple bag of fertilizer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.